Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. The Forgotten Campsite. The sun was sinking below the canopy of towering pines as 5 friends trudged along the uneven trail, their laughter mingling with the rustling leaves. It had been Emily's idea to take a weekend camping trip, a chance to unplug from their busy lives and reconnect with nature. The group, Emily, Jake, Sarah, Noah, and Olivia, have been best friends since college, their bond unshakable despite the years. We're almost there. Jake called from the front of the line, holding up a tattered map. Just another mile or so. Better be worth it, Olivia grumbled, adjusting the straps of her overloaded backpack. My shoulders are killing me. Noah grinned. Don't worry. Jake promised us the perfect spot. Right? Fearless leader. Jake waved them off with a laugh. But as they continued, the dense forest seemed to close in around them. The chirping of birds faded, replaced by an eerie silence. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, though she chalked it up to fatigue and excitement. Finally, they arrived at a small clearing. The space was ideal for camping, with flat ground and a stream bubbling nearby. But as they began unpacking, they noticed something odd. A cluster of tents stood on the far edge of the clearing, their fabric faded and sagging. Nearby, a fire pit filled with cold ash was surrounded by makeshift wooden benches. Food wrappers littered the ground, and a rusty lantern hung from a low branch, swaying gently in the breeze. This doesn't feel right, Sarah said, her brow furrowed. Why would someone leave their campsite like this? Maybe they're coming back, Noah suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. Emily knelt by the fire pit, brushing her fingers over the ash. It's still warm, she murmured, her voice barely audible. Jake frowned. That's impossible. It looks like no one's been here for weeks. Well, someone was here recently, Emily insisted, standing. Maybe we should find another spot. It'll be dark soon, Olivia said, glancing at the setting sun. We might not find anywhere else in time. Reluctantly, the group decided to stay. They pitched their tents a safe distance from the abandoned campsite and lit a fire of their own. As darkness fell, the woods came alive with strange sounds. Twigs snapped in the underbrush, and the wind carried faint whispers that seemed to drift closer and closer. Did you hear that? Sarah whispered, clutching her flashlight. Her wide eyes darted toward the trees. Noah shrugged, though his face was pale. Probably just animals. But Emily wasn't convinced. She'd been feeling uneasy ever since they arrived, and the whispers were growing louder. It was as if unseen figures were circling their camp, watching from the shadows. I'm going to check the old tents, she said, standing abruptly. Jake grabbed her arm. That's a terrible idea. What if whoever left them comes back? Emily shook him off. We need to know what's going on. I'll be quick. Reluctantly, Jake followed, his flashlight slicing through the darkness. The others stayed behind, their voices hushed as they huddled near the fire. The abandoned tents were even more unsettling up close. One was torn open, its interior coated in dark stains. The others were intact but empty, save for a few scattered belongings. A cracked compass, a pair of muddy boots, and a journal with pages ripped out. "This doesn't make sense," Jake muttered. "Why would anyone leave all this behind?" Emily didn't answer. She'd spotted something behind the tents, half buried in the dirt. She knelt to dig it out, revealing a rusted hunting knife. The blade was chipped, and its handle was sticky with a substance she didn't want to identify. "We need to leave," she said, her voice shaking. "Now." Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the forest. Emily and Jake froze, their eyes locking in terror. "Sarah!" Jake yelled, bolting toward the campsite. When they reached the others, they found Sarah trembling by the fire. "I saw someone," she stammered, "standing right there." She pointed to the edge of the clearing. "It's just your imagination," Noah said, though his hands were shaking. "No," Sarah insisted. "I'm not making it up. There was someone watching us." The group huddled closer, their flashlights scanning the darkness. The whispers returned, louder this time, and accompanied by faint footsteps that seemed to circle their camp. Olivia began to cry, her sobs muffled against Noah's shoulder. "We need to get out of here," Emily said, gripping the knife tightly. "We'll pack up and leave now." "In the dark?" Jake asked. "We'll get lost. Better than staying here," Emily shot back. Before anyone could argue, the fire suddenly extinguished, plunging them into darkness. Chaos erupted as they scrambled to relight it, their flashlights flickering ominously. In the brief flashes of light, they saw shadows darting between the trees, figures too quick and silent to be human. "Run!" Jake shouted, grabbing Olivia's hand. The group fled into the forest, their breaths ragged and hearts pounding. The whispers followed, growing louder with each step. Branches clawed at their faces, and the ground seemed to shift beneath their feet. One by one, the friends were separated, their screams echoing in the night. Emily ran until her legs gave out, collapsing in a small clearing. She clutched the knife, her eyes darting around wildly. A figure stepped into the moonlight. It was tall and gaunt, its face obscured by shadows. Emily raised the knife, her hands trembling. "Stay back," she screamed. The figure didn't move, but its whispers filled the air, a cacophony of voices that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere. Emily's vision blurred, and her grip on the knife loosened. She collapsed, the world fading to black. When she awoke, the sun was rising, its golden rays piercing through the trees. The forest was silent again, as if the night's horrors had been a terrible dream. But as Emily stumbled back to the clearing, she found no trace of her friends. The campsite was gone, leaving only a ring of cold ash and a single rusted knife. Emily never spoke of what happened in the forest, and she never returned. But sometimes, late at night, she swore she could hear whispers carried on the wind, calling her back to the forgotten campsite. Story 2. The Silent Camper. The lake was a mirror, perfectly reflecting the dusky hues of the sky as Eric set up his tent on the shoreline. He'd been looking forward to this trip for months, a solo getaway to reconnect with nature and escape the noise of the city. The spot he'd chosen was idyllic, surrounded by tall pines and far enough from the main trails to guarantee solitude. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, Eric had a small fire crackling and a cup of instant coffee steaming in his hand. He leaned back against a log, letting the symphony of crickets and the occasional splash of fish lull him into a peaceful trance. It was then he saw it. Across the lake, on the opposite shore, a figure sat at the water's edge. They were perfectly still, legs crossed, hands resting on their knees. The person faced the lake, their silhouette stark against the dim glow of the rising moon. Eric squinted, wondering if his eyes were playing tricks on him. He hadn't seen anyone else on his way here, and this area was remote. Shaking his head, he chalked it up to coincidence. Probably another camper enjoying the view, he muttered. But as the hours ticked by, the figure didn't move. Not a single twitch or shift in posture. Eric's unease grew. They're just meditating or something, he reasoned aloud, trying to convince himself. Still, he couldn't shake the strange sensation that the figure wasn't merely sitting there. It felt like they were watching him, even though their back was turned. Eventually, exhaustion overtook his nerves. He crawled into his tent, zipping it tight and burying himself in his sleeping bag. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams of shadowy figures and whispers carried on the wind. The next morning, Eric stepped out of his tent and stretched, the crisp morning air biting at his skin. He glanced across the lake, half expecting the figure to still be there. The shore was empty, save for a few birds pecking at the ground. He laughed at himself. Guess I'm not used to being alone out here. The day passed uneventfully. Eric fished, explored the surrounding woods, and sketched the breathtaking scenery in his notebook. By the time evening rolled around, he'd all but forgotten the strange figure. That night, as he sat by the fire again, he glanced across the lake out of habit. His stomach dropped. The figure was back. It was in the exact same position as the night before, completely still and facing the water. The hair on Eric's arm stood on end. He stared, hoping to catch some sign of movement, but there was none. "Who the hell are you?" he muttered under his breath. He stood and waved, shouting, "Hey, you okay over there?" No response. The figure didn't so much as flinch. Eric's shout echoed across the lake, the sound swallowed by the vast silence. He sat back down, gripping his coffee cup tightly. The fire's warmth did little to chase away the chill creeping into his bones. On the third night, Eric decided he'd had enough. He couldn't shake the feeling that the figure wasn't just another camper. There was something wrong about it. The way it appeared only at night, the unnatural stillness. It was as if it was waiting for something, Grabbing his flashlight and a sturdy branch for protection, he set out in his canoe. The lake was eerily calm, the gentle ripples of his paddling the only sound. As he approached the opposite shore, his heartbeat quickened. The figure remained motionless, its outline becoming sharper as he drew closer. It was dressed in dark, tattered clothing, its head tilted slightly forward. Eric's breath caught when he realized the figure's skin had an unnatural pallor, almost gray in the moonlight. "Hey," he called, his voice trembling. "Are you all right?" No response. He beached the canoe and stepped onto the shore, his flashlight beam dancing across the figure. "I'm just here to help," he said, taking cautious steps forward. When he was only a few feet away, he stopped, his legs refusing to carry him closer. The figure's head twitched slightly, as if it had heard him. Slowly, it began to turn. Eric's stomach churned. The figure's face was wrong. Its eyes were black voids, devoid of life, and its mouth was stretched into an unnatural grin, the corners pulling up far too high. The skin looked cracked, like dried clay, with faint black veins spidering across its surface. "What the hell?" Eric whispered, stumbling back. The figure stood in one fluid motion, its limbs moving with an unsettling grace. It began to walk toward him, its feet silent on the rocky shore. Eric bolted, nearly tripping over his own feet as he scrambled back to the canoe. He pushed off, paddling with every ounce of strength he had. He didn't dare look back, but he could feel it, the thing, watching him. When he reached his campsite, he leapt out of the canoe and ran to his tent, throwing his belongings into his backpack with shaking hands. He had to leave. Now, as he packed, he heard a sound that froze him in place. The soft crunch of footsteps on gravel. Slowly, he turned toward the lake. The figure stood at the edge of the water, staring at him, its head tilted to one side as if curious. Then it stepped forward onto the lake. Eric's breath hitched as the thing walked across the surface of the water, its movements deliberate and unhurried. Panic surged through him. He grabbed his pack and sprinted into the woods, abandoning his tent and gear. The whispers began as he ran, low and guttural, seeming to come from all directions. Branches tore at his clothes and skin, but he didn't stop. He ran until his legs gave out, collapsing in a heap on the forest floor. When he dared to look up, he was alone. The whispers had stopped, and the forest was silent again. Eric never returned to the lake. He told no one about what he'd seen, fearing they'd think him insane. But the memory of the silent camper haunted him on quiet nights. He could still hear the whispers, faint and distant, as if calling him back to the water. Story 3. The whispers in the wind. The forest had a reputation. Locals whispered about it in hushed tones, warning hikers and campers to steer clear. Some spoke of eerie legends, spirits that wandered the woods, shadows that moved on their own, and whispers carried on the wind. To the group of friends, however, it sounded like the perfect challenge. "Come on, it'll be fun," Jenna had insisted. Besides, those are just stories. Reluctantly, her friends agreed. By the time they reached the forest's edge, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. They hiked in silence, the weight of the forest's reputation settling over them like a heavy fog. By the time they found a suitable clearing, darkness had fallen. The group, Jenna, Mark, Olivia, and Sam, set up their tents and built a fire. The flickering flames cast long shadows, and the towering trees seemed to close in around them. "All right, ghost story time," Mark announced, grinning as he grabbed a flashlight. "Oh, come on," Olivia groaned. "We're already in the middle of the creepy woods. Do we really need to scare ourselves more?" "That's the whole point," Mark replied, turning the flashlight on and holding it under his chin. "Once, a group of hikers ventured into these very woods." The others laughed nervously as Mark spun his tale, but their laughter faded as a faint sound interrupted him. It was subtle at first, barely audible over the crackling fire and rustling leaves. Then it grew louder. A whisper. "Jenna." Everyone froze. Jenna's eyes widened as she glanced around. Did someone just say my name?" "Very funny," Mark said, lowering the flashlight. "Who's messing with us?" "It wasn't me," Olivia said, her voice trembling. "And I'm pretty sure it wasn't Sam." Sam shook his head, looking pale. "I heard it too, but it wasn't any of us." They fell silent, straining to hear. The whisper came again, drifting on the wind. Mark's bravado faltered. He stood, his flashlight beams slicing through the darkness. "All right, who's out there?" he called. "This isn't funny." No response, only the whispering wind and the eerie stillness of the forest. Let's just stay by the fire," Jenna suggested. "We'll be fine." But as the night wore on, the whispers persisted. They called out each of their names, one by one, soft and insistent. Finally, unable to take it anymore, the group decided to investigate. Armed with flashlights and a growing sense of dread, they ventured into the forest. The whispers seemed to guide them, growing louder as they moved deeper into the woods. "Look," Olivia said, stopping abruptly. Her flashlight illuminated a tree. Etched into the bark was a strange symbol, like a circle with jagged lines radiating from it. "What the hell is that?" Sam whispered. "I've never seen anything like it," Jenna said, running her fingers over the grooves. "It's fresh." They found more symbols as they continued, each one more intricate than the last. Circles, spirals, and shapes they couldn't identify, all carved into the trees. "I think we should go back," Olivia said. Her voice was shaky, her eyes darting around the shadows. "This is getting too weird." Mark hesitated. Maybe she's right. We don't know who's out here. But before they could decide, the whispers grew louder, surrounding them. The air grew cold, and the flashlight beams seemed to falter, the darkness pressing in closer. "Run!" Jenna shouted, and they bolted. The group stumbled back into their campsite, their hearts pounding. The fire had burned low, casting weak, flickering light. They huddled close, too scared to speak. "What do we do?" Sam finally asked. "We can't stay here. We'll leave at first light," Jenna said. "It's too dangerous to hike out now." The others nodded reluctantly, but sleep was impossible. The whispers continued, circling the campsite like predators. At one point, Mark swore he saw a shadow move just beyond the firelight, but when he shone his flashlight, there was nothing there. Dawn couldn't come fast enough. When the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees, the group wasted no time packing up. But as they prepared to leave, they noticed something chilling. The symbols had appeared on the trees around their campsite overnight. Dozens of them, all freshly carved. "Oh my God," Olivia whispered. "They've been here all night." The whispers had stopped, but the forest felt heavier, as if it were holding its breath. Without a word, they began their trek back to the trailhead, moving as quickly as they could. They didn't speak of the incident for weeks, each of them grappling with the experience in their own way. Jenna tried to rationalize it, while Olivia avoided talking about it altogether. Mark and Sam exchanged theories about what they'd encountered, but neither had any answers. Months later, Jenna stumbled across an old book about local legends. One story stood out, a tale about a group of travelers who had vanished in the forest centuries ago. According to the legend, their spirits still wandered the woods, carving symbols into the trees to mark their territory and calling out to the living, luring them deeper into the forest. Jenna closed the book with a shiver, the whispers replaying in her mind. She could still hear her name carried on the wind, faint and distant, as if the forest hadn't quite let her go. Story 4. The Lantern Bearer. The forest was unnervingly silent as dusk fell over the campsite. Thick canopies of leaves overhead blocked most of the twilight, leaving the group of campers, Ella, Mason, Liam, and Chloe, in a dim, green-tinted shadowland. The trip had started as an escape from the noise of city life, but the further they ventured into these woods, the more isolated they felt. "This place is beautiful," Chloe said, setting up her tent, "but it's so quiet. You'd think we'd hear more animals, or even other hikers," Mason added, glancing at their surroundings. "It's like we're the only ones out here." "That's the point," Liam said, grinning as he lit the campfire. "Total solitude. We wanted to get away from people, didn't we?" Ella forced a smile, but a sense of unease gnawed at her. She couldn't put her finger on why the forest felt wrong. She tried to shake off the feeling as they cooked dinner and shared stories around the fire. Laughter echoed through the clearing, but it was short-lived. As the sun disappeared completely, leaving the woods in darkness, Ella's unease deepened. It was Mason who saw it first. "Hey," he said, leaning forward and squinting into the darkness beyond the campsite. "Do you see that?" The others turned, following his gaze. In the distance, a faint light bobbed between the trees. It glowed softly, warm and inviting, like the flicker of an old-fashioned lantern. "Is that another camper?" Chloe asked, standing up. "Or maybe a ranger?" "Could be," Liam said, frowning. But why would they be out here this late? Ella's stomach tightened as she watched the light. It moved with an almost rhythmic sway, as though someone were carrying it. The others didn't seem to share her apprehension. "Let's check it out," Mason said, grabbing his flashlight. "Maybe they know a better spot to camp, or, I don't know, maybe they need help." "I'm not sure this is a good idea," Ella said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We'll just take a quick look," Liam assured her. "If it's nothing, we come right back." Reluctantly, Ella followed as the group set off into the woods, flashlights cutting through the dense darkness. The lantern light stayed just ahead, bobbing and weaving between the trees. It didn't flicker like a fire or dim like a battery-powered lamp. It was steady, constant, and alive somehow. The further they walked, the denser the forest became. Thorny underbrush snagged at their clothes, and the ground grew uneven, forcing them to watch their steps carefully. The light never seemed to get closer, no matter how fast they walked. "It's like it's leading us somewhere," Mason muttered. "Or away from somewhere," Ella said, her voice shaking. "I think we should turn back." "Relax," Liam said. "We've got flashlights and GPS. We'll find our way back if we need to." But Ella wasn't convinced. The forest seemed darker now, the air colder. Even the usual nighttime sounds of crickets and rustling leaves had vanished. All she could hear was their footsteps and the faint crackle of the lantern light ahead. Finally, Chloe stopped. "Guys, this is weird. It's been almost an hour, and we're no closer to that light. Maybe Ella's right. We should go back." Before anyone could respond, the lantern light suddenly blinked out, plunging them into darkness. Panic set in. "Where'd it go?" Mason asked, swinging his flashlight wildly. "I don't know," Liam said, his voice tight. "Just stay calm. Let's head back the way we came." They turned around, but the path was unrecognizable. Trees loomed closer together, their twisted branches forming an almost impenetrable barrier. The underbrush was thicker, and the air felt suffocating. "This isn't right," Chloe said, her voice trembling. "This isn't the way we came." "It has to be," Liam insisted. "Just keep moving." But no matter which direction they went, the forest seemed to shift around them, closing in tighter. Shadows danced at the edges of their flashlight beams, and faint, unidentifiable sounds began to echo through the trees. Whispers, laughter, and footsteps that didn't belong to them. "We're not alone," Ella whispered, clutching Mason's arm. "Something's out here." "Don't say that," Mason said, though his voice betrayed his fear. Hours passed, or maybe just minutes. Time felt meaningless in the oppressive darkness. Their flashlights began to dim, and the sounds grew louder. At one point, Chloe screamed as a hand seemed to brush against her shoulder. But when they turned, there was nothing there. "We're going in circles," Mason said, his voice breaking. "We're never getting out of here." "Stop it," Liam snapped. "We have to stay calm. We will figure this out." But even he didn't sound convinced. Then, just as suddenly as it had vanished, the lantern light reappeared. It glowed brighter this time, almost blindingly so, and it was much closer than before. "There," Liam said. "Follow it." "Are you insane?" Ella shouted. "That's what got us into this mess. Do you have a better idea?" He shot back. Despite her protests, the group followed the light. It moved quickly now, darting through the trees as if taunting them. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into an incomprehensible cacophony. Shadows darted around them, just out of reach. Finally, the light stopped. It hovered in the center of a small clearing, illuminating a strange sight. A circle of stones, each etched with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the light. The air was heavy with an unearthly energy. "What is this?" Chloe whispered. Before anyone could answer, the light flared brilliantly, forcing them to shield their eyes. When it dimmed, the lantern was gone. In its place stood a figure cloaked in darkness, its face obscured, but its presence undeniable. It raised an arm, pointing directly at them. They ran. They didn't look back, didn't care where they were going. The forest seemed to fight them every step of the way, but eventually they burst out onto the trailhead, gasping for air. The first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon, and the oppressive darkness of the forest began to lift. They didn't speak as they packed up their campsite and left. None of them wanted to acknowledge what they'd seen, what they'd experienced. It was only later, as they drove away, that Ella dared to glance back at the forest. For a brief moment, she thought she saw the lantern light flicker between the trees, watching them go. Story 5. The Vanishing Tent. The cool mountain air whispered through the trees as the Darnell family set up their campsite. The secluded spot in the forest, miles away from the nearest town, was chosen for its tranquility. James and Clara Darnell had been camping enthusiasts for years and were eager to share the experience with their teenage children, Owen and Lily. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, the family sat around the campfire, sharing stories and roasting marshmallows. "This is perfect," Clara said, leaning against James. "Just us, the stars, and nature. No Wi-Fi, though," Owen muttered, earning a laugh from his sister. "You'll survive," Lily teased. When the fire burned low, they retired to their tents. James and Clara shared one, while Owen and Lily had their own, pitched a few feet apart. The forest settled into a still, eerie silence, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves and distant hoots of an owl. James woke with a start. The air inside the tent felt too quiet, the kind of silence that pressed against your ears. He glanced at Clara, still sound asleep, then at his watch. It was 3:12 a.m. A strange sound reached his ears, a scraping like nails dragging across fabric. He held his breath, straining to hear. It stopped, deciding it was nothing more than a curious animal. He laid back down. When morning came, Clara's scream jolted him awake. "Where's Owen?" Clara's voice trembled as she stood near where his tent had been. James scrambled out of their tent. The spot where Owen and Lily's tent had stood was empty, the ground smooth as if nothing had ever been there. Lily's tent was still intact, but the other was gone, along with Owen. Lily emerged from her tent, rubbing her eyes. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice groggy. "Owen's tent, it's gone," Clara said, panic rising in her voice. Lily's eyes widened. "That's not possible. He was right there last night." James examined the area where the tent had stood. The dirt was undisturbed, except for faint, claw-like marks circling the space. The marks were long and deep, unlike anything he'd seen before. "It's probably a prank," he said, though his voice betrayed his doubt. "Owen might be trying to scare us." "Owen wouldn't leave without his phone," Lily said, holding up his device, which she'd found by the fire pit. Clara clutched James's arm. "What do we do?" "We'll find him," James said firmly. "Let's start searching." The family combed through the surrounding forest, calling Owen's name. The deeper they ventured, the more unsettling the forest became. The air grew colder, and the trees seemed to loom closer, their branches intertwining like skeletal fingers. Clara stopped abruptly. "Do you hear that?" James paused, listening. A faint sound carried through the trees, a low, guttural growl that sent a chill down his spine. "What is that?" Lily whispered, gripping her mother's hand. "Probably an animal," James said, though he didn't believe it. "Let's keep moving." As they pressed on, they found more claw-like marks on the trees and ground. Some of the trees bore deep gouges, as though something massive had raked its claws against them. James's unease grew with each step. Hours passed with no sign of Owen. Exhausted and scared, the family returned to the campsite. They sat by the cold fire pit, trying to piece together what had happened. "We need to call for help," Clara said. "We can't do this on our own." James nodded. "I'll head to the car and drive to town. It'll take a few hours, but I'll bring back help." "You're not going alone," Clara insisted. "Someone needs to stay with Lily," James said, his tone firm. "I'll be fine." Reluctantly, Clara agreed. James grabbed a flashlight and set off, leaving Clara and Lily by the fire. The hours dragged on. The forest seemed to close in around the campsite, the shadows growing longer as the sun dipped below the horizon. Clara tried to stay calm for Lily's sake, but her nerves were frayed. "Mom," Lily whispered, What if something took Owen?" "Don't think like that," Clara said, though her voice wavered. "We'll find him." A rustling noise interrupted them. Clara grabbed a stick from the fire pit, brandishing it like a weapon. "Who's there?" she called. The rustling grew louder, closer. Then a figure emerged from the trees. It was James, his face pale and eyes wide with fear. "We need to leave. Now," he said, his voice trembling. "What happened?" Clara asked, standing up. "The car." James swallowed hard. "It's gone, and there's something out there. I saw it. It's not an animal." Before they could respond, a deafening roar echoed through the forest. The ground seemed to tremble beneath their feet. Lily screamed. and James pulled them toward the remaining tent. "We can't stay here," Clara said, her voice shaking. "We have to run." "Where?" James asked. "We're surrounded." The roar came again, closer this time. The family huddled together, their breaths shallow and hearts pounding. Shadows moved between the trees, circling the campsite. Then the tent collapsed as though swatted by an unseen force. "Go!" James shouted, pushing them toward the forest. They ran blindly, branches scratching at their faces and roots threatening to trip them. The growls and roars followed, relentless. Clara glanced back and saw a massive shape moving through the trees, its glowing eyes fixed on them. "This way," James yelled, leading them toward a rocky outcrop. They squeezed into a narrow crevice, trembling as the creature prowled nearby. Its heavy footsteps echoed, and its guttural growls sent shivers down their spines. Hours passed before the sounds faded. The family emerged cautiously, the first rays of dawn breaking through the trees. Exhausted and terrified, they stumbled back to the campsite. Owen's tent was back, standing where it had been the night before. But when they unzipped it, they found it empty. The claw marks around the site were deeper now, carving symbols into the ground that none of them could understand. The Darnells didn't wait to pack up. They left everything behind, fleeing the forest and vowing never to return. To this day, Owen's disappearance remains a mystery. The family speaks little of that night, but sometimes Clara wakes in the dead of night, hearing faint growls and the sound of claws scraping against the floor, and she wonders if the forest has truly let them go. Story 6. The Haunted Cave. The mountains loomed high and silent as the group of 4 explorers set up camp near the mouth of the cave. The sky, tinged with the last hues of sunset, cast long shadows over the rugged terrain. The cave, dark, gaping, and silent, had a reputation as one of the most cursed places in the region. Legend spoke of eerie noises, shadowy figures, and those who entered never returning. To Rachel, the leader of their group, it was precisely the kind of challenge she sought. "I can't believe we're doing this," muttered Andy, the youngest and most hesitant of the group, as he dropped his backpack by the fire pit. "You'll thank me later when you're the only one of your friends who's braved a cursed cave," Rachel said, grinning as she unpacked their gear. "Or we'll all be dead," Elena, the team's medic, added dryly, though her tone was teasing. "Come on," said Sam, their tech-savvy navigator. "It's just a bunch of old stories. If people actually disappeared here, it would be all over the news." "Tell that to the locals," Andy retorted. "They wouldn't even sell me batteries for my flashlight when I mentioned where we were headed." The group shared uneasy laughter before settling into their routines. By the time darkness had fully fallen, they had a roaring fire, a modest dinner prepared, and their tents pitched. The cave loomed behind them, an imposing black void that seemed to drink in the firelight. The first strange sound came just after midnight. Rachel was the first to hear it, a faint, almost melodic whisper that seemed to drift from the cave's mouth. She sat up, straining her ears. "Do you hear that?" she asked. Elena, sharing a tent with her, stirred. "Hear what?" Rachel motioned for her to stay quiet. The whisper grew louder, clearer. It was no longer melodic but disjointed, like fragments of words spoken by multiple voices. "Okay, that's creepy," Elena admitted. "Wake the others." By the time the group was gathered, the whispers had stopped. They stood around the fire, flashlights in hand, staring at the cave. "Probably just the wind," Sam said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Wind doesn't sound like a dozen people arguing in a tunnel," Elena countered. Rachel grinned, trying to shake off the tension. "This is what we came for, isn't it? Adventure, mystery, a story worth telling. Let's just keep watching shifts," Andy said. "If anything happens, we'll deal with it together." Reluctantly, the group agreed. The second strange event happened during Sam's shift. He sat by the fire, fiddling with his GPS tracker, when he noticed movement near the cave. At first, he thought it was an animal, a shadow flitting across the rocks. But then it grew larger, taking on a humanoid shape. "Rachel," he hissed, shaking her awake. "Something's out there." Rachel was instantly alert, grabbing her flashlight. Together, they shone their beams toward the cave. The figure was gone. "What did you see?" Rachel asked. Sam hesitated. "It looked like a person, but wrong. Too tall, too thin, and its eyes glowed." Rachel frowned. "We'll check it out at dawn. For now, wake the others. We're staying together." By morning, the cave appeared as innocuous as ever. The group approached cautiously, flashlights and cameras at the ready. The entrance was wide and jagged, like a jaguar's maw. Inside, the air was cool and damp, carrying a faint metallic tang. "Let's not go too far," Andy said, his voice echoing. "Just enough to prove we were here." Rachel ignored him, leading the way deeper into the cave. The walls were etched with strange markings, symbols that none of them recognized. Sam took photos while Elena examined the symbols. "These don't look natural," she said, "but they're not any language I've seen." Deeper they went, the light from the entrance fading behind them. The whispers began again, faint but unmistakable. This time, they came from all directions. "We should turn back," Andy said, gripping his flashlight tightly. "Wait," Rachel said, stopping abruptly. "Do you see that?" Ahead, a faint light glimmered, as though someone had lit a lantern deeper in the cave. "Who else would be here?" Elena whispered. "Only one way to find out," Rachel said, moving toward the light. "Rachel, no," Andy called, but she was already out of reach. The light led Rachel around a bend and out of sight. The others hurried after her, only to find an empty chamber. The light was gone. So was Rachel. "Rachel," Sam called, his voice echoing eerily. There was no response. Instead, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Shadows danced along the walls, though there was no source of light. "We need to leave," Andy said, backing toward the exit. "No, we can't just leave her," Elena argued, though her fear was evident. "If we stay, we'll end up like her," Andy shot back. Before they could decide, a blood-curdling scream ripped through the cave. It was Rachel's voice, filled with terror and pain. "She's still alive," Elena said, tears streaming down her face. "We have to help her." The scream cut off abruptly, replaced by silence. Then, the shadows on the walls began to converge, forming a towering figure with glowing eyes. "Run!" Sam yelled, grabbing Elena and pulling her toward the exit. They stumbled out of the cave, breathless and terrified. The sunlight felt alien, the forest too quiet. Andy collapsed to his knees, clutching his head. "She's gone," he whispered. "Rachel's gone. We have to tell someone," Elena said, her voice trembling. "The police, the rangers." "And say what?" Sam snapped. "That accursed cave swallowed our friend?" The group fell into uneasy silence, each haunted by the memory of Rachel's scream. They packed up their camp in record time, leaving behind the cave and its horrors. Months later, Sam received an email from an anonymous sender. Attached was a photo, a blurry image of the cave's interior. In the center stood Rachel, her face pale and her eyes glowing, surrounded by shadowy figures. Below the image, a single message: "She's one of us now." Story 7. The Shapeshifter. The campsite was nestled in a quiet clearing surrounded by dense forest. The group of 5, Mark, Jessica, Tyler, Mia, and Ryan, had spent the day hiking, fishing, and laughing around the fire. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, they were ready for a peaceful evening of marshmallows and ghost stories. "All right, we're running low on firewood," Mark announced, brushing off his jeans. "I'll grab some more before it gets completely dark." "Don't go too far," Jessica warned. "You know how easy it is to get lost out here." Mark waved her off with a grin. "I'll be back in 10 minutes. Don't start the next story without me." The group watched him disappear into the woods, his flashlight bobbing as he walked. They continued chatting, the crackling fire casting dancing shadows on their faces. 10 minutes turned to 15, then 20. The laughter died down, replaced by an uneasy silence. "Should we go look for him?" Mia asked, her voice tinged with worry. Before anyone could answer, Mark emerged from the trees, his arms full of firewood. "Told you I'd be back," he said, dropping the wood beside the fire. Jessica frowned. "You took longer than I thought. Everything okay?" "Yeah, just got a little turnaround," Mark replied, sitting down. He grabbed a stick and speared a marshmallow, holding it over the flames. Something about him seemed off, though. His smile was a little too wide, his movements slightly awkward. Jessica exchanged a glance with Tyler, who raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The first oddity appeared when they began a new round of ghost stories. Mark, usually the one who could resist jumping in with quips or fake scare tactics, was silent. He sat rigidly, his marshmallow still untouched on the stick, now charred black. "Mark, you okay?" Jessica asked. He blinked as if startled. "Yeah, fine. Just tired." Jessica nodded, but the unease gnawed at her. Mark never got tired before everyone else. He thrived on being the center of attention. The second sign came when Ryan accidentally knocked over his thermos, spilling water near the fire. Mark's head whipped around so fast it made everyone jump. "Careful," he snapped, his voice sharp and cold. Ryan held up his hands. "Relax, man. It's just water." Mark stared at him for a moment longer than necessary, then turned back to the fire without another word. The group exchanged uneasy glances, the tension thickening. As the night deepened, the changes became more pronounced. Mark's skin seemed different, pale, almost translucent, with faint veins visible beneath. His eyes, once a warm hazel, now seemed darker, almost black in the firelight. "Mark, you're acting weird," Mia finally said, breaking the silence. He looked up, his face expressionless. "Weird how? You're just not yourself," Mia said, shrinking under his gaze. Mark tilted his head, studying her. "Maybe you're imagining things." The group fell silent again, the crackling fire the only sound. Jessica leaned toward Tyler and whispered, "Something is seriously wrong." Later, when the fire had burned low, Jessica decided to confront him. "Mark, what happened in the woods?" He looked at her, his face eerily blank. "Nothing. I told you, I just got turned around." "Are you sure?" she pressed. "Because you're not acting like yourself." Mark's gaze fixed on her, unblinking. "What are you implying?" Jessica swallowed hard. "I'm saying you're different. You look different. You sound different. And it's creeping everyone out." Mark stood abruptly, his movements unnaturally fluid. "I think I'm done for the night." He walked toward his tent without another word. "We need to talk," Jessica whispered to the others once he was out of earshot. The group huddled near the fire, their voices low. "That's not Mark," Mia said, trembling. "I don't know what it is, but it's not him." "You think something replaced him?" Tyler asked, his voice shaking. "I don't know," Jessica admitted. "But he's not right. We need to be careful. What if he hears us?" Ryan whispered, glancing nervously toward Mark's tent. "We stick together," Jessica said firmly. "No one goes off alone, and we keep watch tonight." The third sign came just before dawn. Jessica, on watch with Tyler, heard faint rustling near the tents. She shone her flashlight toward the noise, her heart pounding. Mark's tent was empty. "He's gone," Jessica whispered, shaking Tyler awake. "What do you mean he's gone?" Tyler asked, sitting up quickly. Before she could answer, a low growl rumbled from the darkness. The group froze, their flashlights darting wildly. Mark emerged from the trees, but it wasn't Mark anymore. His skin shimmered like oil, and his limbs moved with an unnatural grace. His eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the beam of their flashlights. "You shouldn't have stayed," he said, his voice distorted, layered with something deeper. "What are you?" Jessica demanded, her voice trembling. "Mark, or whatever he was now, smiled, revealing too many teeth. Hungry, chaos erupted. The group scattered, each running in a different direction. Jessica sprinted toward the car, her flashlight bouncing wildly. She could hear the others shouting, their voices cutting through the forest. A scream pierced the air, Mia's voice, high and terrified. Jessica fought the urge to turn back, her survival instincts kicking in. She reached the car, fumbling for the keys in her pocket. The growl came again, closer this time. Jessica turned, her flashlight catching a glimpse of the creature. It was no longer human, its form shifting and rippling like a mirage. The keys slipped from her shaking hands as the creature lunged. Jessica woke up in the driver's seat, the morning light filtering through the trees. The car doors were locked, and the keys were in the ignition. Her head throbbed, and her memories were a blur. The campsite was empty. No tents, no fire pit, no sign of her friends. It was as if they had never been there. On the dashboard, scrawled in a dark, sticky substance, were 3 words. "We'll be back." Story 8. The Eternal Campfire. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly, the dense canopy of trees filtering the sunlight into soft, golden beams. Olivia and James had decided to escape their stressful city lives for a weekend of camping and reconnection. Their destination was a remote part of the forest, untouched by the noise of the modern world. Armed with a map, a tent, and a shared sense of adventure, they trekked deep into the wilderness. By late afternoon, they stumbled upon a clearing that seemed perfect for their campsite. What struck them immediately was the campfire. It sat at the center of the clearing, a ring of dark stones encircling bright, dancing flames. Yet, as they approached, Olivia noticed something odd. "James, do you feel that?" she asked, shivering despite the warm sunlight. James crouched near the fire, holding his hand over the flames. "They're cold. How is that possible?" Olivia knelt beside him. The fire burned brightly, crackling and flickering as if it were fueled by logs and kindling. Yet the heat was absent. In its place was a faint, unnatural chill. Maybe it's some kind of trick, a chemical reaction. James offered, though his voice wavered. Olivia glanced around the clearing. Who would build a campfire way out here and leave it like this? James shrugged. Maybe a ranger? Or another camper. It's weird, but it's here, and it'll save us some work tonight. Reluctantly, Olivia agreed. They pitched their tent a safe distance from the fire and prepared for the evening. As darkness fell, the fire remained steady, its flames undiminished. Olivia couldn't shake the unease that gnawed at her. The first nightmare came to Olivia that night. She dreamed of a man sitting by the campfire, his face obscured by shadows. He stared into the flames, mumbling incoherently. Slowly, his features began to melt, as if the fire was pulling the essence from him. Olivia woke with a start, gasping for air. Beside her, James stirred. "Bad dream?" he asked groggily. She nodded. "You?" James frowned. "Yeah, There was this girl screaming by the fire. She kept pointing at me like she wanted me to do something. They exchanged uneasy glances, the fire's cold glow casting flickering shadows on the tent walls. The next day, they tried to shake off the night's events, hiking through the surrounding forest. Yet, when they returned to the clearing that evening, the fire was still burning, its flames as steady as before. James poked at it with a stick. "There's no wood in here," he said. "Just ashes." Olivia's stomach churned. "We should leave. This doesn't feel right." "Come on," James said. "It's just a weird fire. We've already set up camp." That night, the nightmares returned. Olivia saw a family, a mother, father, and 2 children, huddled around the fire. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes hollow. The flames seemed to grow brighter, feeding on their despair. One by one, the family members collapsed, their bodies turning to ash. She woke up screaming, her heart racing. James was sitting upright, his face pale. "I saw them too," he whispered. "The family?" she asked, her voice trembling. He nodded. "We need to leave. Now." They packed their belongings in a frenzy, but as they prepared to leave, a thick fog rolled into the clearing. It was as if the forest itself conspired to keep them there. No matter which direction they turned, they found themselves back at the campfire. "This isn't possible," Olivia said, her voice shaking. "We just need to keep trying," James insisted, though his confidence was fading. The night was filled with strange sounds. Whispers carried on the wind, faint laughter that seemed to echo from the trees. The fire burned brighter, its cold light casting eerie patterns on the surrounding forest. By the 3rd night, the dreams had grown worse. They no longer waited for sleep to find them. Sitting by the fire, James and Olivia began to see images in the flames. Faces twisted in agony, hands clawing at the air, mouths frozen mid-scream. "It's feeding on us," Olivia realized. "Our fears, our nightmares. That's how it stays alive." James stood abruptly. "Then we destroy it." He grabbed the canister of water they'd brought for their trip and poured it over the fire. The flames hissed and sputtered, but instead of dying, they grew taller, their cold light intensifying. "Stop!" Olivia shouted, pulling him back. "You're making it stronger." The fire roared, and from its depths emerged shadowy figures, their forms flickering like mirages. They surrounded the couple, their whispers growing louder, overlapping into a deafening cacophony. "Run!" James yelled, grabbing Olivia's hand. They sprinted into the woods, the fog thick and unrelenting. The whispers followed them, growing closer with every step. Branches clawed at their faces and arms, the forest itself seeming to trap them. Finally, they broke through the tree line and stumbled onto an old dirt road. When they turned back, the clearing was gone. No fire, no campsite, just an unbroken expanse of trees. Months later, Olivia couldn't shake the experience. She spent hours researching legends of cursed campfires, but nothing matched what they'd encountered. James refused to talk about it, throwing himself into work to forget. One evening, while scrolling through an online forum about supernatural encounters, Olivia found a post that sent chills down her spine. It described a cold fire deep in the woods that fed on fear and despair. The final line of the post read, "If you find it, never look into the flames." Story 9. The Forest Watcher. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long, golden shadows over the dense forest as a group of 5 friends set up their campsite. The air was crisp with the earthy scent of pine, and the quiet hum of nature surrounded them. They had driven for hours to reach this remote location, eager to escape the noise and chaos of their daily lives. "Perfect spot," Mark said, securing the final tent stake. He straightened and admired their makeshift camp. A central fire pit sat ready for the evening, surrounded by their tents. "Perfect," echoed Lisa, tossing her backpack down. "No cell service, no distractions. Except for that creepy forest," Emily said, half joking as she nodded toward the dense thicket of trees. The others laughed, though the towering woods did feel more oppressive as the daylight waned. "Relax," Mark said. "It's just trees." As night fell, the group gathered around the fire, swapping stories and roasting marshmallows. The laughter and warmth of the firelight pushed away the encroaching darkness. But then Sarah, who had been gazing into the shadows, stiffened. "Hey," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Does anyone else see that?" The others followed her gaze. Among the dark outlines of the trees, a figure stood. It was tall, unnaturally so, with glowing amber eyes that pierced the gloom. "It's probably an animal," Kevin said, though his voice betrayed his unease. "That's not an animal," Sarah replied. The figure didn't move. It simply watched. Even from a distance, its presence felt suffocating. The group fell silent, the crackling fire suddenly too loud. By morning, the figure was gone. The group shook off their unease, attributing it to overactive imaginations and the eerie atmosphere of the forest. But as they explored the area that day, they couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Whenever they paused, they caught glimpses of amber eyes in the shadows, always just out of reach. Lisa tried to laugh it off. "We're in the middle of nowhere. Probably just a deer or something curious." Emily wasn't convinced. Deer don't have glowing eyes, and they don't stare like that. That night, the figure returned closer this time. It loomed at the edge of the firelight, just beyond the circle of warmth. Its glowing eyes never blinked, and its tall, thin frame seemed to sway gently, as if in rhythm with the rustling trees. "What do you want?" Mark yelled, his voice trembling. He grabbed a burning stick from the fire and waved it toward the figure. It didn't react. Sarah grabbed his arm. "Don't provoke it," she whispered. Mark lowered the stick. The group huddled closer to the fire, their earlier laughter replaced by a tense silence. They watched the figure until exhaustion overtook them one by one. In the morning, they decided to leave, The unease had become unbearable. But as they packed up their gear, they discovered something chilling. Their campsite was surrounded by strange symbols etched into the dirt and trees. They were crude, almost claw-like, and arranged in circular patterns around the camp. Did someone do this while we slept? Emily asked, her voice shaking. I don't know, Mark said, but we're getting out of here. Now. They started down the forest trail, following the map and GPS, but every path seemed to twist and loop back to the clearing. Hours passed, and frustration mounted. This doesn't make any sense, Lisa said, examining the map for the 100th time. We should have been out of here by now. It's like the forest doesn't want us to leave, Sarah said, glancing nervously at the trees. By dusk, they were back at the campsite. The fire, which they had extinguished that morning, was burning again. The figure stood on the opposite side of the clearing, closer than ever before. Its glowing eyes seemed brighter, and its swaying motion more pronounced. We can't stay here another night, Kevin said. We need to keep moving, even if it's dark. Mark hesitated. What if we're walking in circles because of it? He gestured toward the figure. Emily's voice rose. So we just stay here and wait for whatever it is to do whatever it's planning? No one had an answer. That night, the whispers began, faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, then louder, as if the wind carried voices speaking words just beyond comprehension. The group clung to each other by the fire, their eyes darting to the shadows. The figure circled the clearing now, its glowing eyes never leaving them. Occasionally it would stop, its head tilting as if listening to the whispers. It's driving us mad, Sarah whispered. That's what it wants. Kevin snapped. Enough of this. He grabbed the hatchet they had brought for chopping wood and charged at the figure. Kevin, no. Lisa screamed. The moment Kevin crossed the edge of the firelight, the whispers stopped. The figure stood still, watching. Kevin swung the hatchet, but it passed through the figure as if it were smoke. The glowing eyes flared brighter, and Kevin screamed, clutching his head. He dropped to the ground, unconscious. They dragged Kevin back to the fire, his breathing shallow but steady. The figure resumed its place at the edge of the clearing, its swaying more deliberate, almost mocking. We can't fight it, Mark said. We can't leave. What do we do? Maybe we give it what it wants, Sarah said, her voice hollow. What does it want? Emily asked. Sarah didn't answer. As dawn approached, the fire began to die. The figure faded with the light, retreating into the trees. Kevin woke, disoriented but alive. The group packed their things in silence, determined to try escaping again. This time, the forest paths seemed clear. By midday, they emerged onto the dirt road where they had parked their car. Relief washed over them, but none of them spoke until they were miles away. What was it? Emily finally asked. No one had an answer. The glowing eyes haunted their dreams for weeks, and the forest, once a place of solace, became a memory they would never revisit. But late one night, months later, Sarah awoke to a faint glow outside her bedroom window. Amber eyes stared back at her from the darkness. Story 10. The Trail of Ash. The late afternoon sun filtered through the dense canopy of trees as 5 friends, Emma, Chris, Natalie, Jason, and Mia, trekked deeper into the forest. Their destination was a remote campsite known for its untouched beauty. They were eager for an escape from the chaos of their urban lives. The air was crisp, and the forest floor was damp with the earthy smell of moss and decayed leaves. As they walked, Emma, who was leading the group, paused and pointed to the ground. "What's that?" she asked, crouching down. A thin, uneven trail of ash snaked along the path, leading deeper into the woods. Chris leaned in, frowning. Maybe someone had a fire and spilled some ash. "But it goes on forever," Natalie said, her voice tinged with curiosity. "Who'd carry ash through the forest like this?" Jason shrugged. "Probably nothing. Let's keep moving. We got a long way to go." They continued on, but the trail of ash remained, weaving its way ahead of them. The unease was subtle at first, but as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, the group couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. By the time they reached the campsite, twilight had settled over the forest. The clearing was surrounded by towering pines, their tops swaying gently in the evening breeze. They pitched their tents near the center and lit a fire, hoping its warmth would stave off the growing chill. As they ate and chatted, the mood lightened. The ash trail was forgotten, replaced by laughter and the comforting crackle of flames. But when Mia wandered away from the group to grab her water bottle from her tent, she froze. "Guys," she called out, her voice shaking. "You need to see this." The others hurried over. Surrounding her tent were strange burn marks in the ground, circular and uneven, as though someone had pressed searingly hot coals into the earth. "What the hell?" Chris muttered, running his fingers over the marks. They were still warm to the touch. "Did someone come through here while we were setting up?" Jason asked, his eyes scanning the darkening forest. Emma shook her head. "We'd have noticed. We're miles from anyone." The group decided to stay close to the fire that night, their tents arranged in a tight circle around it. Sleep came fitfully, with every rustle of leaves or snap of a branch jolting someone awake. By dawn, they discovered something far worse. Mia's tent was gone, along with Mia herself. Panic erupted as they searched the campsite, calling her name and scanning the surrounding forest. Near the edge of the clearing, they found a new trail of ash leading away from the camp. "We have to follow it," Emma said, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. Jason hesitated. "What if it's a trap? And what if it leads us to Mia?" Emma shot back. With no better option, they packed up quickly and followed the ash. It led them deeper into the forest, winding through areas where the trees grew so close together that sunlight barely pierced through. The air grew heavy, and the usual sounds of the forest, bird song, rustling leaves, were conspicuously absent. After hours of trekking, The ash trail ended in a scorched clearing. The ground was blackened, as if consumed by a fire that had long since burned out. At the center of the clearing stood a twisted, charred tree, its branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. "Mia," Emma called out, her voice trembling. The silence was deafening. Then, faintly, they heard it, a low, almost imperceptible whisper carried on the breeze. It sounded like Mia's voice calling their names. "Where is she?" Natalie whispered, clutching Chris's arm. Jason stepped closer to the tree. "Maybe she's trapped?" He reached out to touch the bark, but the moment his fingers brushed it, the whisper stopped. The tree began to creak and groan, as though alive. Jason stumbled back, and from the shadows of the clearing emerged figures. They were humanoid but wrong. Their bodies were blackened and cracked, like embers struggling to reignite. Their eyes glowed faintly, and as they moved, ash fell from their forms. "Run!" Emma screamed. The group bolted back toward the forest, but the creatures pursued them, their movements unnaturally fast. The air filled with the acrid smell of burning, and the ash trail seemed to expand, surrounding them in a suffocating haze. They ran until their lungs burned, eventually stumbling upon a stream. The creatures halted at its edge, their glowing eyes fixed on the group. One by one, they faded into the ash, carried away by an unseen wind. The friends collapsed by the stream, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and terror. They waited until nightfall, too afraid to move. When they finally dared to return to the campsite, they found it untouched. There was no sign of the ash trail, the burn marks, or Mia. Days later, rangers found the group wandering near the forest's edge, disoriented and pale. When asked about Mia, none of them could provide an answer. They left the forest behind, vowing never to return. But the nightmares followed. Each of them dreamed of the scorched clearing, the twisted tree, and the glowing eyes watching them from the shadows. And somewhere, far away in the depths of the forest, the ash trail waited for its next travelers.